Hi, and welcome to another, although different, episode of the Recovery Podcast. Today I'm happy to introduce you to a segment I hope to make a regular part of the show called TRP Topics, a topic-based episode series where we take a step away from the stories of recovery we all love to have in-depth discussions about topics in and around recovery. Our guest for our very first TRP Topics installment is Dr. Brett Dowdy, who is the head of psychology at the Linder Center in Cincinnati and someone who spoke a lot of wisdom into me when I was just becoming an adult. Today, Brett and I are going to delve into the topic of depression, what it is, what it looks like, how it affects us in recovery, and what we can do about it. Hi, and thank you for checking out another episode of the Recovery Podcast. My name is Matt, and start off with a little bit of housekeeping like we always do. And let me, by stating a little bit of a disclaimer that nobody on this podcast, myself included, is a spokesperson or representative of the recovery programs that we may mention while on this podcast. That's just because we want to honor the spirit of anonymity that most recovery programs have, even if we can't do it in the literal sense, being on a public platform. But just know that any one of us that talk into one of these mics, we could go back out, and that does not mean that our recovery programs do not work. It just means that we're human and we're addicts. Go figure. So with that out of the way, I'm very excited to introduce somebody that had a pretty profound impact on my life in my early 20s. My wife's wife, both me and my wife actually, in the young adult ministry that we were a part of at a church called Rivers Crossing. And that is Dr. Brett Dowdy.
Yeah.
Hi, Brett.
Thanks for having me, brother.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. Yeah. I actually joked in Paul Salazar's podcast, I did a little bit of analyzing of it. I'm like, so this is probably why. And I was like, and he was like, I never thought about that way. And I was like, you can thank my faux doctorate. And I can't wait to get an actual doctor on here. So you're going to, I'm really, the reason why you're here is I need some credibility.
Yeah.
This is a dumpster fire and we need you.
I'm here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, about your life, and what you do for a living.
Sure. A little bit about my life. I'm married to Anna and have 19-year-old twins. So we're empty nesters.
Oh.
As of this
College?
fall. Yeah.
Nice.
Finally happened.
Is that good or bad? Are you struggling with it, or is it?
Don't tell them, but it's been great. It's been great.
Don't share this with them.
Don't share it. It's been good. So I've been practicing, I guess, for 23 years at this point.
Okay.
I got my doctoral degree in 2000. And really the goal was not to do psychology initially. I really wanted to do something in the church, do some ministry, and really felt God's call during an undergraduate internship working with some children, and just realizing that I could do ministry anywhere, but I couldn't reach kids that were hurting the way these kids were with a ministry background. So changed direction a little bit, left undergrad to go get my doctoral degree in psychology. And currently I'm practicing at the Linder Center of Hope, where I'm the chief of psychology, and have a mix of executive duties and still a small caseload of people.
You have a large caseload of people at the church. So jokes on you're still in ministry.
Still, yes.
So the reason why I asked you to be on is I wanted to, as I was kind of coming up with the idea for the podcast, obviously the majority of what we talk about is we share, I have people on to share the recovery stories. But I also wanted to make sure that in that, I think there's a lot of topics surrounding either relating directly to recovery or topics that affect recovery or that things that tend to be very prevalent in recovery, like what we're talking about today, which is depression. And I feel like you're pretty qualified to talk about that. Yeah. And so for those of you that are listening that maybe don't see the connection yet, I think we'll get to that. But let's start off with, let's just kind of start bird's eye, kind of zoom out a little bit, and let's just talk about what depression is, kind of give us the definition and symptoms and things like that, how they might manifest in somebody's life in general.
Yeah, the interesting thing is depression can actually look quite a bit different across humans, but some symptoms that a lot of people experience, a sense of sadness or emptiness, sometimes like a loss of self,
Mm.
a loss of a identity or purpose. People often feel a real struggle to connect with pleasurable things. So things they used to like, hobbies, work, have become very flat and disinterested. To things that we see in our bodies, people tend to overeat or lose their appetite. So we see weight loss, weight gain, loss of sexual interest or sex drive, concentration, attention become impaired. Um, Not all, but a significant number of people will notice despair, suicidal thoughts, hopelessness, worthlessness. And interestingly, in men, the primary presentation of depression is often irritability or anger. And so we often get overlooked. People will just think that we're a jerk, when in reality, we might actually be struggling with major depression.
You know, in these when I interview people on this podcast, I every single time somebody will say something, and it'll hit me. I'll get that gut check, and I'm like, oh man, they're talking about me.
Yeah.
um, to be forthright with you and those listening, depression is a big part of my life. It's a part of my recovery journey, and it's as early as as early as I can remember. My earliest memories, depression was there.
Yeah.
And I think it's important because I see it a lot in recovery. Um, and a lot of us struggle with it, and we don't understand what it is. We don't. We know how we feel, but the problem is that if you've been in it, if you've lived in it for so long, it just becomes the norm. It becomes the filter that our life flows through. And a lot of times we don't. I've seen myself and a lot of people that I engage in recovery around and with. We don't realize we struggle until we get in recovery. So the one thing I kind of thought of when you were talking, then, just to make a quick segue, is anxiety is also a big problem, a big thing I see in recovery. So, but I don't want to spend a ton of time on anxiety, but it feels like there's some overlap there sometimes. Yeah. So can you kind of take us through that a little bit and help us differentiate?
Yeah, medically, we artificially separate them as depression and anxiety, but in reality, they're probably the same thing. That they're, if nothing else, close cousins. They travel together. And a lot of people who have depression have some measure of anxiety.
For sure. Yeah.
Or vice versa. And some people will talk about they shift. So if my depression improves a little bit, my anxiety gets a little worse.
Right.
But they're very difficult to tease apart, and we're often treating them at the same time.
Okay.
And something about you talking about your early childhood made me think about that there's also different types of depression.
Okay.
There's one that we used to call dysthymia. Now we call it persistent depressive disorder. And these are folks who've had depression for at least 2 years. And it's this low-grade chronic depression that doesn't seem to go away. And then we have major depressive disorder, which must last at least 2 weeks. And some people, unfortunately, Matt, and you may be one of them, have experienced what we call double depression. So I have persistent depressive disorder, and occasionally it gets really severe, and I get lost. And so this double depression actually is a little more complicated to treat.
Okay.
And people who have persistent depressive disorder, it's kind of the lens, like you were talking about, that they just look through. Then we have people who get depressed with seasonal changes, seasonal affective disorder. And then we have non-clinical depression that we probably all experience, which situational events in our life can cause us to be down, but they too can lead into some eventual major depressive disorder.
Yeah, you mentioned the seasonal depression, and right now, as of the recording of this podcast, it's February,
right?
And so there's been a lot of in the rooms of recovery and a lot of the open sharing. There's been a lot of like, man, I just feel like I'm in a rut,
right?
And I for sure see that. I can see where that is. You mentioned that I most likely, or like I definitely could present with both types of the depression that you mentioned, and for sure, I think I do. I tend to have personally, like, there's always this, like, I can only describe it as like an annoying sound
Yeah.
that's always there.
Yeah.
That's what my depression feels like most of the time. It's always kind of there. It's always this like
Mm-hmm.
discomfort emotionally and mentally that's
Yeah.
always there. And thankfully, through finding the right medication, that it's not gone, but it's manageable.
Good.
And so, but I also have times of year that aren't. I don't know. I guess it would fall under seasonal, but it's not in the literal sense of
Right.
season. Like for me personally, like halfway through the summer is a big one for me.
Yep.
Every year, it's the same thing. And then typically, like the beginning of fall
Yeah.
hits me pretty hard. And then I for whatever reason tend not to be depressed when everybody else is depressed.
Yes.
So I'm like,
Gray's good for you.
yeah, I'm like hopping around in February, like this is great, and everybody's like, shut up. So I want to make sure we intersect here, and specifically because this is the Recovery Podcast, and I'm assuming that you probably also work a lot with people who are in recovery, with addiction-ish, substance issues, or codependency, grief, all of those things. So can you walk me through the connections that you found in your professional and in your ministry life between the clinical depression and what you see or depression in the clinical sense, and what you see with people who struggle with addiction issues?
Yeah. Well, we just looked at the data. It would say that about 30% of people in recovery for some kind of addiction are also struggling with depression. And I actually think that's probably an underestimate.
I felt like that was low.
Yeah. Yeah. And largely because not everyone is willing to identify it
Sure.
as saying it out loud, or they may not actually know that what I'm also struggling with is depression. And so these illnesses co-occur. And so we're always curious when people are struggling with addiction of what else might be going on from a mental health perspective, and really trying to help people get treatment for both. And we used to think about, well, if you have a substance use problem, we need to address that first. It's primary, and your mental health is secondary. And we really don't think that way anymore. We know these are co-occurring illnesses. They need to be treated at the same time. And people get the best results when they do treatment both for their mental health and addiction, regardless of the type or style, at the same time.
Yeah. For me, and I'm going to kind of interject, I'm probably going to interject a lot of my personal experience in this conversation. Because like I said, depression is something I've had to deal with, especially since I've gotten sober. And for me, I definitely can see how you would assume that dealing with and I'm kind of royal we here, how somebody would assume that, okay, this person has let's say they're an alcoholic, somebody who dependent and full-blown alcoholic dependent can't stop without having withdrawals and DTs and all that. You would look at that and say, we got to address that because that's literally destroying their life. The problem that I've seen in my life, my own life, and those that like I said, that I work closely with in the walls of recovery, is what led a lot of us to self-medicating or to alcoholism or whatever, substance abuse or codependency or whatever, is that the problem with that constant annoying hum of depression or anxiety in the back of your head is that it drives you crazy.
Yeah.
You feel when you feel like you can't gain there's no pleasure in the everyday things that other people tend to be satisfied in. You find that having those first 3 beers makes you feel better. They're like, oh, all of a sudden, like, you don't feel your depression anymore. That hum's gone. Oh wait, without that hum, like, it's crazy how much more sociable I am. I have a great time. And then next thing you know, you get to in this pattern of self-medicating, and the depression gets worse.
That's right.
And worse and worse. And so your using goes up and up, and it's this vicious cycle of, I have to use more to dampen the effects, the ever increasing effects of my depression. But the more I use, the more depressed I feel, the worse my circumstances feel, which also affects my depression. And as far as the chemical side, I'm completely oblivious. I don't understand the brain chemistry. I know there's an aspect of that as well that I
Yeah.
don't quite comprehend. Um, I know it's there, and so when you, sorry, there's I'm hearing this background noise, and it kind of threw me off a little bit. So when you in your medical practice, as you start to address, as the perspective has changed, and we need to address both the depressive, the clinical side, as well
Yeah.
as the substance abuse. How is that something that has changed over the course of your career, or is this something that has always kind of been your stance to take with this? Was it something that you realized along the way, or with
Mhm.
everybody else, or how recent of a change in perspective would you say this has been?
Yeah, I would say it's probably been 15 or 20 years. So we're probably at the beginning of my career, we were starting to make a shift
Hmm.
and to try to better understand how do we help people not get in and the trap, really, which is what you're talking about. This idea that when one gets better, the other one starts to get worse, and then I use the other to medicate the pain. And so we're really trying to help people have the tools and the resources so that when they do get sober and they have to address the pain, that they can do that more successfully.
Mm.
Because we know that mental health symptoms, anxiety, depression being big ones, drive people back.
Right.
Because substances or anytime you're activating dopamine, it does give you relief.
Right.
And we're always seeking relief. And our brains are always looking for the shortcut. And we've learned that the shortcut is to use something
Hmm.
to make me feel better. Most of us really don't like the long route to feeling better.
Right.
It's like, please, sooner
It's
the better.
well, it's an
Yeah.
interesting kind of cultural and societal thing to talk
Yeah.
about, right? Where I've always found it interesting that, eh, and I say this with a little bit of skepticism, because I'm sure there's angles of this that are not being taken into account. But it seems like when people talk about, like, I think a lot of us have had older people in our life that talk about the good old days, right? And they're
Yeah.
like, back in the day, we didn't have all of these crazy problems. Like, nobody was depressed. We didn't have ADHD, like the big one, like, all these gluten intolerance and stuff. Like, it's a big one. That I'm like, okay, maybe people just eating bread. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it does seem like as more things, as more avenues of instant gratification become available to us as a society, it does seem like there's this correlation of the more depressed we've become, the
Right.
more dissatisfied we've become. Why do you think that is? What do you think the correlation is between those two things?
Yeah, I think there's probably lots of kind of factors. But one that comes to mind that I think's worth mentioning is we're standing on our dopamine receptors all the time in our society and culture, and addiction in particular. And so we know that our brain chemistry is getting impacted, whether we're addicted to our devices or to alcohol or to some form of drugs or to porn or gambling, shopping. All of these are pretty dopamine activating.
Right.
And at some point, when we get sober, we pull away the substance, our ability to feel that same feeling is diminished because our dopamine receptors are now, if we think about it, they're kind of exhausted. They're not firing the same way for normal pleasurable things. So
Right.
a conversation with my wife is now kind of boring, or even out with friends sober is difficult. So most recovery programs are really teaching people how to have fun again, how to connect with people, how to be in community, how to find pleasure. And early in sobriety, people will often get pretty discouraged because they're told if you just get sober, your life's going to be better. And they get sober and they're struggling to feel and enjoy anything. And depending on your drug of choice, it takes between 90 days and a year to get your dopamine receptors working again. And so it can be a long way to go, right? And
For sure.
people can be struggling with depression and a deep feeling of emptiness and despair. And we know that they need to hold on, but sometimes we don't prepare people enough and talk enough about, yes, there may be a season where your brain isn't working right. And that's why a lot of recovery programs are 90 days, because for a lot of us, that is the point at which our brain starts to come back online.
Man, it's such an interesting point to make, because again, kind of going back to my own recovery story, those first 90 days were brutal
Yeah.
for me. And um, I was coming off of a multi-year daily use case scenario of using something called kratom, and I don't like to dwell too much on the substance of choice, but that's what it was. And for those of you who might know what it is, it's not as chemically, what's the word I'm like when somebody comes off of a long-term heroin addiction or alcoholism, there's like real medical things to be concerned about coming off of some a chemical dependence like that. It wasn't quite like that for me, but it was not fun.
Right.
It was not good. And I've heard people talk about it. I've heard people talk about it with like, I stopped smoking weed, which, kind of what I kind of hear, like the pothead guys is like, man, it's non addictive. I'm like,
Psych.
I was like, I don't know. Like, I'm pretty sure that anything that makes you feel good, your brain can find a way.
Yeah.
Again, in my professional opinion, it's just the experiences that I've seen is that I don't care if it's TV. I don't care if it's just anything that, like you said, kind of gets that dopamine going. It's hard to stop. And, for me, those first 90 days, like we talk a lot in recovery about living one day at a time. It was, for me, it was moment by moment, most of the time phone call by phone call.
Yeah.
And the thing I think is the success that I see in recovery tends to be people who, especially in those early days, depend on other people.
That's
they
right.
lean heavily
Yeah.
on their sponsors. They really, lean heavily on the people that they see in meetings. Like there's I think they call it 90 and 90 in AA, where it's 90 meetings in 90 days. And it's not just like, get in here, you're a mess. It's also, there's a method to that particular, I'll call it madness just to complete the saying. But the idea behind that is get in the routine. Part of it is get in the routine of relying on something else. And part of it is you can't do it by yourself.
Yeah.
As far as people that I know personally, again, personal anecdote here, is I've never seen anybody white knuckle it successfully by themselves and come out the other side not miserable.
Yeah.
And, we call it, a lot of people have heard the term dry drunk,
Right.
where like, they're not drinking, but they're absolutely still an alcoholic. Their behaviors and kind of the stories go, and the people that have gone that route is I was a meaner person than I was when I was drinking. And, for me, those first 90 days were brutal because I was, before I engaged in my recovery, one of the biggest fears I had is if I give this up, what am I going to have to lean on?
That's
like,
right.
what am I going to have? What's going to make me happy is really what the crux of it was.
Right.
And in fact, my prayer to, sitting in a step study and when I finally surrendered to God in my recovery journey was, if I give this to you, you got to give me something better. Now, after those 9, it was definitely in that time frame of that around 90-day point. I distinctly remember the first time I felt any joy out of something that wasn't using. And that was, I'm driving in the car with my kids. It's a beautiful summer day. Like, weather's perfect. It's one of the rare summer days in Ohio where it's not 1,000,000% humidity. The windows are down. My kids are in the back seat and we're jamming to some cheesy pop dance playlist that they love. And I'm singing with them because I'm a goofball. And I have this moment, and I will never forget where I was. I will never forget the song that was playing. I had this moment where it's almost like time slowed down. Like, and it was like, there is nothing wrong right now. There's no other shoe that's going to drop. There's no, I can enjoy this moment for exactly what it is. And I think there's a spiritual component to that. I think, for sure. But I would assume that there's also what you described, what you were kind of talking about was my brain kind of resetting and finding pleasure in things that I had taken for granted because I was just like standing on my dopamine receptors.
Yeah.
As you said. The problem that I think, going back to those first 90 days and with people engaging in recovery, is that you are miserable a lot of times.
Hmm.
And, if you're listening to this and maybe you're thinking about engaging in with recovery, you are early in your recovery and you're struggling. This is going to sound like I'm trying to talk you out of it, but I'm not. But it's hard,
Yeah.
and it's going to be hard, and anticipate it's going to be hard. And, again, if you're one of those people I just described, definitely make sure that you've got people around you that you can lean on, because those having conversations with people who aren't in the state of mind that you're in can help you not lose perspective that things will eventually get better. But a problem I think I tend to see is that there's no sense of a light at the end of the tunnel when you
Yeah.
start that. So what would you suggest? What are some behavioral things? What are some things that we can do in that kind of reset process to help us get through those initial days of kind of our brain kind of resetting itself,
Yeah.
so to speak?
So we see this thought in early recovery and in chronic depression, or this idea that it's never going to end.
Mm.
This is my life as it now is. And it becomes problematic, right? Because a lot of our brains will go to, well, why keep persisting? Why fight so hard, even to the extent of why live? And so it's a problematic thought. And the good news, it's not a true thought. That depression is very treatable and recovery works. And so to your point, I would say the number one thing to do is surround yourself with good community, that you don't have to do this alone, whether you have a mental health problem or an addiction or a combination of both, that doing it alone is not very successful, and it's really hard if you are able to do it. When we think about like the self-help literature, like these books are flying off the shelves, but only about 3% of us can use willpower alone to accomplish what those books suggest we should do.
Right.
And we really do need a community. So I would say behaviorally choices, get in with a group of people who will stand beside you, hold you up, call you, check on you, be what you cannot be for yourself.
Mm.
And I think we all can relate to that. And the recovery community, unlike any community I know, is the most welcoming place for people who are struggling. And then I would say if you have a co-occurring, you're recovering from addiction, but you kind of know, like, I have a depression problem, and the depression problem may have even led to the addiction. It may have been the beginning point. It was that effort to escape. Then I would say get some good medical treatment. What we know is that depression can be a clinical depression, but it can also be kind of secondary to medical problems. So people with heart disease, diabetes, thyroid issues, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, these things can be the origin story for depression. And a lot of folks don't take the time to go get a good medical workup, or their medical workup gets confounded by the fact that they're drinking too much or they're smoking marijuana every day. And so their problems get dismissed as only being an addiction problem.
Right, like a side effect.
Yeah,
It's not a stretch to get
Right.
there. I can
It's
understand.
not. Most of us say, hey, sober up, and then maybe this is going to get better. But so I would say early recovery, get a good medical workup, that your situation may be complicated by some underlying health concerns. And then next, I would say really consider adding a therapist to your recovery program. So if you're in Celebrate Recovery or AA, NA, one of these wonderful programs, considering taking the hard step of seeing someone who might specialize in depression or anxiety, depending on what's going on for you. And then I would make sure that you're seeing someone who really does specialize in whatever you're struggling with. Some of us have trauma as like an underlying, very common among people with addiction, super high amounts of trauma. And so I would say, are you seeing a therapist that knows this recovery path, who does this work all the time? This is their heartbeat, is to really help people out of trauma, is a really good step.
You brought up trauma, and what is the link between? Is there is at least in professionally speaking, I'm in anecdotally, but is there a professional link between trauma and people having a tendency towards depression or anxiety, but in this sense, we'll kind of narrow it down to depression.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I don't know all the ins and outs. What I would say is that pain is, from my experience, what people are trying to get out of. All of us are, when we put someone in pain, that we will see them go to great lengths to get out of it. And so if you think about psychic pain or mental pain, the memories and all the junk that trauma brings, people find out pretty quickly that substances ease their pain and give them not only relief, but also maybe connected to other people who are using. So it gives us this false sense of community.
That's interesting. It's a good, interesting point.
So trauma is a really big problem in the addiction community, and it is really treatable. We have some really great treatments for trauma, just like with depression. But if we go back to depression being the core thing, just behaviorally, I would say one of our big jobs in recovery from depression is to learn how to disobey it. So if we think about what does depression call us to do, calls us to isolate, withdraw, keep to yourself, crawl back into bed, avoid. Depression speaks lots of messages. So it not only brings urges to withdraw, but it brings condemnation and criticisms and thoughts about being worthless and unlovable. And so really we've got to learn to become really disobedient against depression. And the problem is it has, as you know, Matt, it has this pull. It has
Gravity.
a whole body kind of experience. So it's pulling you towards itself. And every time we obey it, so I crawl into bed because I'm depressed, it gets stronger. And so I've got to learn how to go opposite of everything it tells me. So if depression says lay down, then I've got to sit in a chair or call a friend or go for a walk. And sometimes we coached people with depression with too strong of language. Like, hey, Matt, why don't you just pick up running? I hear it's really great for depression. Right. And it's like, I can barely get out of bed.
Maybe
you
we
want
start
me to
small.
be a marathon runner. Yeah. I hear Ironman competitions
You
are
tried
really
CrossFit?
good.
Those
Exactly.
CrossFit
Those
guys.
CrossFit people, they're never depressed. So yeah, we've got to disobey, and we have to do it incrementally, and we got to start small, but we've got to see depression as our enemy. And people who've been depressed a really long time, it gets blurry. Like, well, am I depressed? Is this a character problem? Am I just lazy? Is there something just broken about me? Has God withdrawn his love from me? Am I a rejected person? It gets really tied to identity when you're depressed for a long time. And so we've got to break those lies. Depression's an illness. And some people, unfortunately, like yourself, start in childhood. It makes it much more difficult. Recovery is much more complicated when depression starts as a young child. So we've got to disobey depression. We've got to really start to counter the lies. And a community helps us do that. It's very difficult to do that all alone in the darkness of your room.
I think your mind, especially when you have, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. But in my experience with my depression, my mind is my worst place to be by myself. And it's so interesting, man. I'm like, I wanted to leap out of my chair as you're talking about this, because it kind of clicked with me. I was like, man, with depression, you're just miserable. So obviously it's not a stretch that you might end up engaging in things that, especially let's say if you're a Christian and you look and there's these things that I'm, as a follower of Jesus, I'm not supposed to do. Look at pornography or drink or use drugs or engage in relationships that maybe I know are unhealthy for me or whatever. Or, lay in bed and watch Netflix for days on end. So as depression pulls you in, it, like you said, it has this, I mean, it literally feels like gravity is pulling you towards it. And as you start to engage in those things that you shouldn't, again, and this is my own experience as somebody who's I would say identified as a Christian early in my life, really engaged with Jesus post recovery, but I've got all these behaviors that I'm picking up to ease the symptoms of my depression and make me feel something. I mean, sometimes it's not even pleasure; it's just something.
That's right.
And there's this sense of, especially in terms of God, where I'm like, I always wrote off this feeling of isolation from God as I'm not doing the right things. Like, why would I feel God's love?
Yeah.
And that just pulled me farther, and
Right.
it pulled me farther, and it grew. It continued to grow that distance, that chasm between me and God. And when I finally engaged in recovery, and the beautiful principle of recovery being you come exactly as you are. You admit all of your faults. You admit all of the things that you can think that are broken inside of you, and then you engage in the process of God revealing more things, more character defects that you work through with your inventory through a step study. I started with that acceptance of this is who I am. There are broken things about me. There are things that I engage in that aren't right. As I started to work towards following Jesus wholeheartedly and started trying to live life on life's terms, I realized that there was a certain, like where you said that the things kind of become blurred and gray, those things kind of started to get separated from me. And so I'm hearing and I'm experiencing that God loves me exactly where I'm at. Faults, warts, and all. And even when I mess up, I'm having this profound experience in my walk in faith and in my recovery journey where when I screw up and I come back to God, that's when I feel God's love the most intensely. And I'm like, there's part of me that's like, isn't this like reinforcing bad behavior? But what I'm realizing is that it's not fair. God's love isn't fair. It's not based on what I deserve. It's based on what he wants to give me. And I know what's promised to me is that he loves me.
Yeah.
And he's actively pulling me out of this. That's the point. It was probably about 6 to 8 months in my recovery journey as I'm beginning to enjoy my life again, but I'm still struggling. And I kind of have an idea based on what my doctor told me that I had depression. Never really took medication for it. And I finally had the thought that like, is my brain fighting me? Like, because there were times in my life, where in my journey where I'm actively working to correct character defects in myself, and I'm still miserable. And now that I'm beginning to enjoy the things in my life, like I said, I can start to see that, okay, like now that the substance abuse stuff is out of the way, and that is kind of, that cloud is kind of lifted out of my life. There's something else that's not right. There's no reason I should feel the way that I feel. And that's when I finally was like, okay, like it's time. I'm going to go back and see my doctor.
Yeah.
And so I went back and, I'm talking to him, and I love my doctor because he's very blunt. And he's like, well, a lot of people, he kind of was like, a lot of people engage in substance abuse when to escape, to self-medicate their depression. He's like, can you explain your weight? I'm like, okay, thanks. Thank you for that. And he's like, let's try the medication.
Yeah.
And then, if we can't find a medication that works, he mentioned, taking it a step further, going to see a psychologist, psychiatrist. Well, so the difference being a psychiatrist does medication, correct? And so he started me on, God, what is the most common one? Antidepressant.
Zoloft.
Prozac.
Prozac. Yeah.
Prozac. I heard that it's like next to penicillin, it's like the most researched medication on the market or something. And I tried that, and it kind of worked. And we went through a few different other medications, and I ended up on a different one, Celexa, I think. And like I said, it doesn't. What I found out is that it doesn't erase it. It doesn't just dispel it from my life. But now, in my own experiences, especially the longer that I've continued to take my medication, I've continued to work my recovery program, I'm able to understand, I'm able to separate what is maybe God convicting me about something, because I know what that feels like. That's a very different, that does not have the same isolating, condemning annotation to it that my depression has. So I understand what that feels like, because that leads me to do something better with myself. That urges me to do something better. It energizes me to move on, to the next right thing. And the opposite of it being my depression tells me stay in bed, isolate. For me, the indicators tend to come from the people around me, that I still continually surround myself with people every day that know me and love me and that are in my corner, that say like, hey, like you've been kind of distant lately. Like you don't really answer the phone when I call as much. Like you've canceled plans with me a few times. And those are the moments that I kind of go, red flags.
Yeah.
Like, okay, like and then a lot of times I'll look on the calendar and be like, oh, I'm in July. Like right in the big black hole that is my worst depression of the year every year. And so I definitely personally want to encourage people that as you begin your recovery journey and you think maybe you're struggling with depression, if you have a doctor, go talk to your doctor.
That's right.
If you don't have a doctor, go get a doctor.
Yeah.
I understand that for a lot of us, especially, like there are financial things to take into consideration. Maybe you don't have insurance. I promise you that as you continue to engage in your recovery, you're going to find that you're worth it. And even monetarily, if it's tough, there are things that I know there are things out there that could help. And I want to make sure that I'm sensitive to wherever you're at, whether financially and the struggles that you may have. But I promise you that your health is as important as anything else in your life. And I would encourage you to seek it out and see if there's any avenue that you can seek medical help. And there was a question that I have lost on me, but do you have anything to add to that as I recollect my thoughts?
I appreciate you sharing about your own story with medication, because I think the more of us who say it out loud, it gives people permission to do it. And especially in the Christian community, for some reason, we have a bias against treating depression that we don't against diabetes or cancer. And so I think it normalizes it, and I appreciate that. The research is really clear that the best combination for depression is therapy and medication, and that will help about 80% of people. And we really talk about management with depression or remission, but not everyone gets complete remission. Some people are managing. Some people are really kind of making this pretty painful thing something they can live with and have a life that's worth living, and that's what we're really aiming for. But our medication is a valuable tool. It's not our only one. We could talk about some other things you could do if medication is not helping you. But it is very much worth trying, and it can be a real tool.
Yeah, I've noticed it's kind of referring back to the episode I did with Paul Salazar, which is a great story if you haven't listened to it, where he talks about how he, specifically in his early 20s, he realizes that he has this crippling anxiety in his life.
Yeah.
And he can't even step foot outside of where he lives without three or four beers in him. And he starts to self-medicate, and he even has this thought that, like, I don't, like, at least it's not a pill. Like, at least I'm not in, it's not something that some quack doctor gave me or whatever. And there's a lot of that sentiment that I see, especially with men.
Yes.
And why, even, is there anything you could speak? Do you have any idea, like, what is the stigma with that? Like, why do you think there's such a ardent stigma? Especially, it seems to persist despite all of the, I think, a general acceptance that people societally, I see that, like, it's okay to take a medication for your depression, but there's still this, like, hard line, just stigma against taking medication.
Yeah, I really think it has a lot to do with that therapy. Antidepressants are for weaker people, softer people, and we've got so much pressure on us to be strong. And so to do anything that looks like a weakness is really threatening. And unfortunately, having 3 to 6 beers to manage my agoraphobia would be considered like the manly thing to do.
Right.
And I think the more of us who speak about it, we can give people permission, to just really get help. I mean, sadly, we know alcohol is a depressant. just like marijuana. And yet we use these substances as our primary treatment for depression.
I remember you and I had that conversation at one point, and I'm going to be giving my story on the podcast. My sponsor Mitch is going to be interviewing me, so I'm going to be on the other side of this process. But I'd overdosed at one point, and I remember you and I ran into each other, and I was kind of telling you what had happened and my alcohol and opiate abuse at that time, and you're like, so alcohol is a depressant, opiates are a depressant, you're depressed. Like, it was basically but you said it in a way that was like, not like, I don't want it, like the way I'm describing it probably sounds judgmental as hell. That is not the way, but you said it in a way that was like, it was like, so I was like, oh yeah, that's probably not the best idea.
Let's treat that depression.
Right.
Yeah.
And it only took me 10 years, but I do remember what you said.
Yeah. Good.
I'm a slow learner.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it doesn't matter what we're all struggling with something.
Right.
And most often that something is actually like deepening the problem that we're trying to get away from. Mm-hmm. So shame being a really painful human emotion, but we do things that bring more shame into our life so that we can escape the feeling of shame. It's like being human is complicated and it doesn't make a lot of sense, but we're almost always doing something to deepen and worsen our core problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there's a reason why, whether you're in AA or NA, which don't have a specific higher power, but they encourage you, it is a requirement that you have a higher power. Or with Celebrate Recovery, where it is a Christ-centered recovery program, and Christ being our higher power. I think what you just described about being human, being complicated, and how we have this tendency to lean into the negative in a way that makes it worse is the reason why we need a higher power in recovery. We need something bigger than ourselves, because I just listen. Darrell Wilson had one of my favorite quotes. Has one of my favorite quotes I've ever heard in recovery, and that nobody comes in here on a winning streak. Like none of us are batting 1,000 coming into recovery, and even if I'm only speaking to the people that find themselves in recovery, we got our own devices are what got us here.
Yeah.
And so seeking out that higher power is the hope that we have that something bigger than us can guide us through this complicated process and just the complicated nature of being human. Yeah. And it's definitely what, even for me, it took a higher power for me to even realize that my depression was my own brain was fighting me in my attempt to do better in myself. Left from my own devices without a higher power, I don't know if I would have come to grips with my depression. Yeah. And so it's interesting to me that we still struggle with seeking medical help, clinical help with depression, with mental health in general. I think in the church, I think that's such an, for lack of a better word, kind of an ass backwards approach to take. And I definitely don't feel like that's an approach that the church I attend goes to or takes, or other places like Rivers Crossing where you attend. And there's got to be a reason. There's got to be an inline. I mean, and even beyond the masculine side of it. I mean, why? I've kind of wondered why the church is it like? Do they feel like, is it the sense of like not having enough faith or something like that? And I mean, what do you have any thoughts about why it tends to be prevalent in the church?
Yeah, I've observed a couple things over the years. I mean, even 20 years ago, getting my doctoral degree in psychology, I was in probably a more legalistic church, or coming out of one at the time, and really was given quite a hard time for even like going to school and considering this, that it was really looked at with a lot of disdain. And so while I can appreciate that on one hand, I think often we are throwing out good medical treatment, good science, with a fear that we're somehow going to collude with things that don't line up with Christ's mission for us. And I think because mental illness affects our thoughts and our behaviors and our moods, we can often tie this over simply to sin. And if you would just do the right thing, and if you would just follow what Christ teaches, then you'll be better. And while that there is truth to that, some of the time it's often that especially with mental illness and mental health issues, that is much more complicated than simply, changing our behavior. There are many underlying, medical issues that we need to address. And I think the church is improving.
I do too. Yeah, for sure.
But it has certainly propagated this idea that pray more, do more, do better Christian things, and all these things are going to clear up. And I think for many people, the answer has been pretty unsatisfying and oversimplified. So we're getting there.
Yeah. One of the thoughts I had when I started to address my depression, I had friends, close friends, and one in particular that was in recovery with me who was struggling with a lot of the same things that I was struggling with. And there were some pretty clear signs of depression, and he was just like, I don't know why, he was very reluctant to go to the doctor.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, like, you just had knee surgery.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any apprehension about like did you have the same type of apprehension about that as you do about going to see a doctor, about trying a medication for your depression? And he's like, no. I'm like, well, I don't really think it's that different. I think that, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but for me, what I realized is, as far as the taking medication to address, to help with my depression, and there's more to addressing my depression than just the medication. It's no different than the pill I might take for my allergies, right, or for high blood pressure, and I hope that if maybe you're listening to this and you have had that stigma, you've carried that stigma, or you've felt that stigma directed towards you or somebody else, that you understand. I think it's important to understand that you're taking care of yourself in the same way that you would take care of yourself with any other medical issue. And again, it took me a while in my recovery to understand that it was not my recovery, not using, was not the only thing that was important in my recovery. In fact, the hardest part about my recovery was actually what came after not using, right, which was learning how to live life on life's terms. And what I realized is that I can't operate at my best capacity as a father or a husband or a friend or accountability partner or a sponsor or whatever my role is in my life, at a deficit that my depression makes me run at. And I think it was hard for me to come to that place, but once I did, it started to snowball, and other things in my life started getting better too. I started to realize that addressing my weight was a big thing for me, and in fact, my almost my entire time being sober, I've lived in a step study, basically.
Good
so,
for you, man.
So I got sober in a step study, and then as soon as that step study ended, I went, I think I'm supposed to lead a step study if you need somebody. And so I did. And it was the most rewarding experience of my recovery. And two, that second one was harder than the one I got sober in, because that's when God started to really pull at my heart about addressing things that I kind of dismissed as not being recovery related, not consciously, but I was like, it's different. It's not. I realized that my weight was contributing to my depression, or I don't know which one caused which, or if there's one that caused the other. I do know that my weight was definitely not helping me feel less depressed, and so I decided to get weight loss surgery in this past December, and the entire step study was me wrestling with that decision. So again, if you're engaging in recovery, God's going to keep asking things from you. And as my best friend and kind of my childhood best friend and somebody I work recovery with, my buddy Kyle, one of the things that he said when we got sober was, "This is way more than I bargained for." But again, not trying to talk anybody out of engaging in recovery. It is the most worthwhile endeavor I think that you'll ever engage in, because there's nothing that's going to flow out of your life Again, whether you're a father or a mother or sibling, friend, any of those things, all of those things are affected by the state you're in as a human being. Hey guys, sorry to interrupt this podcast, but we ran into a little bit of technical difficulties again, and I'm sorry this has happened on another episode, but we're still trying to kind of figure the technical side out. So we ran into a little issue with the recording suddenly stopping, and also there's a little bit of noise issue in the remainder of the recording. But please, 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 if you've gotten this far, the next part is so important. I really encourage you to listen and finish this one out. So I appreciate you. Thank you so much for being patient, and we're going to start right about now. All right, sorry about that. Again, I'm still new to podcasting, so I was telling Brad that the way that the recording interface likes power, it's very picky, and so it didn't switch. Anyway, none of that's important. The recording cut out, and so we're going to start again. So I think what I was saying was, if you are engaging in recovery, God's going to keep asking things of you, but it's the most worthwhile thing you can do. Yeah. So, is there anything else? Is there any aspect or anything to talk about with depression that you feel like we've missed so far that you would like to touch on?
Yeah, I think there's maybe two domains that I would love for people to be thinking about. The first one is that if you're doing depression, you're in recovery groups, you're still in depression, you're taking medicine, in recovery groups, in therapy maybe, and it's just not working. There are other treatments. And one that I would point to makes a lot of people nervous. So if you talk about not wanting to take medicine, this one's really going to stir you, right? Which is electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. And we all have the one flew over the cuckoo's nest vision in our mind, but ECT is about 80 to 90% effective in putting major depression in remission. So we think about medication, about 50% rate. And so it's safe. We do it under anesthesia. You don't have big memory loss. Those are the treatment today has very few side effects, 10 to 12 sessions, and your depression for 80 to 90% of people is gone. And so I just there are other medical treatments that are paid for by insurance and Medicare, these kind of things that people can have access to that really work. So see a local provider, people who are treating depression, particularly if you have treatment refractory depression, which means you've tried lots of things and you're stuck. The last thing I think is worth us talking about is suicide, just real briefly. People in recovery and active addiction are at much higher risk for suicide. So if you're an alcoholic and you struggle with severe depression, your risk is quite high. And so if you love someone who's struggling, the most life-saving thing you can do is to ask them if they're having suicidal thoughts and if they have a plan or some intent to harm themselves. And we often worry that if I bring it up, it's actually going to plant the seed of suicide, and that's not true. Actually talking openly with people you love actually decreases the risk of suicide. And we need to be mindful. And if you're that person who is suicidal, I just want to urge you, get some help. A lie that suicidal people often believe is that others will be better off without them, and it's so not true. That suicide is a transfer of pain. It's not an end of pain. And people who commit suicide, their children are at much, much higher risk for committing suicide. You're not replaceable. And the pain that people leave behind when suicide happens, I've just seen it over and over again, is devastating. Depression is treatable, and you can get better. And don't give up hope. And don't let depression lie to you and try to take your life. So keep fighting for you and your family and for your recovery. It's worth it.
Yeah. I haven't I've talked about it in recovery. I haven't, I'm pretty open about my recovery. I don't just walk around with a megaphone and tell people that I'm in recovery, but I really don't have a problem with anybody knowing about it. But the one thing that does, again, going back to the stigmas, is the one part of my recovery that I don't talk a lot about, mainly because it's a hard topic to just, it has to be in the right context, and you just don't walk around and talk about suicide like that, but for me, and this is not an uncommon thing. And in fact, most people that I've talked to that have shared, that I know have in-depth knowledge about the recovery, almost all of us, especially with substance abuse, we've had those moments where it's either suicidal thoughts or a sense of, I don't want to wake up tomorrow.
Yeah.
And those things are not that far away from each other.
That's right.
And for me, I definitely, most of the time, especially when I was deep in the pit of despair that was my using days, there were like, the thought of suicide entered my mind as like, I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want to be here. This life isn't worth living. I'm miserable. I'm in pain.
Yeah.
I'm doing nothing but hurting everybody around me. The thing that I realized, and I'm going to contribute it to God's grace and the Holy Spirit, is that I had the thought that if I do this, all I'm doing is taking all the pain and all the misery that I have, and I'm depositing it on my children and my wife and my grandparents and all of the people that care about me. Yeah. That pain just doesn't die with me.
That's right.
It gets distributed to everybody that it cares about me. And I didn't want my kids to grow up and my dad committed suicide. Like, where's your dad? And he died. What happened? He killed himself. Like, I didn't want that hanging over their heads. Yeah. And I'm so glad. I'm so glad that I didn't do anything. As much as I didn't, in other ways, I was subconsciously trying to kill myself with my behavior. Man, there is hope.
There is.
You don't, the promise of recovery is that every recovery program you join, it says the same. If you don't want to live life the way you've lived life, you don't have to anymore. And that seems like a very grandiose promise to make, especially if you've been around recovery. You see people come in and out, and I was one of those people for 12 years. I was in and out of recovery. But man, when you get it, when it finally clicks and you really find freedom and you find transformation, and you finally learn to live life on life's terms, and you get to actually enjoy your life, you realize that for a lot of us, and especially I'll speak for me, when I said that prayer that, God, if I give this up, you got to give me something better, he really didn't give me anything new. What happened was my perspective on the things I had changed. And all of a sudden, I found joy in being a father. I found joy in being a husband. I found joy in being a friend. I found joy in engaging in my local church. I found joy in engaging with other people, other recovering addicts in my recovery program. Doing the next right thing becomes something that you find pleasure in.
Yeah.
And the kind of pleasure that you don't have to worry about how it's going to affect you the next day. So again, I'm speaking to somebody who's early in recovery or thinking about engaging in recovery, or maybe you just need a word of encouragement that it's worth it. You're worth it. It's a worthwhile endeavor. And if you're at the place where, if you're having any suicidal thoughts, please talk to somebody. Please talk to somebody. Share what, don't worry about how you think that other people are going to see you. Because in my experience, I don't really go to a recovery program, talk to somebody, talk to a doctor. Because I promise you that they're not going to think any less of you because you're having suicidal thoughts, especially in a recovery program. Because guess what? 9 out of 10 of those people that are in there, they probably had the same thoughts or something very akin to it. So please, there are places that you can go that you will be welcomed with open arms, and you can be honest and not have to pretend that you're somebody you're not. But if you are if you're thinking about recovery, you're in recovery, you're worth it.
Yep.
So with that said, is there anything you would like to share to end on, or you feel pretty good about where we're at?
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Matt.
Yeah, I really appreciate you doing this.
Yeah.
I'm always astounded by how much better my guests are than I am as a as a podcast host, which is a good problem to have. But thank you, everybody who listened.
Yeah.
Again, sorry for the technical difficulties. Thank you again for doing this.
Welcome,
I would love to have you on again if you'd be willing to.
Sounds good.
So,
Let's do it.
check out the other episodes. We're on Amazon, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook. If you want to find us, we're out there. So that's the Recovery Podcast. And if you'd like to share your story, please send an email to contacttherecoverypodcast@gmail.com or hit me up on Twitter or Facebook. Thank you guys so much and have a great day.